Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. Really excited about today's guest. She's got a really courageous story, and it's all about resilience and overcoming hardships and setbacks and turning it into something meaningful. She's written a book, which we'll talk about later today. To Vivian Sieber, and she is the author of Kino and Kinder, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But Vivian, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
Yeah. So you have a history, but then you turned it into something good, a force for good. Talk about your story and the challenge you overcame, and give more into the nuancing. Really.
I always knew that my grandmother and father were real refugees from Vienna, but they were Jews and they had to leave rather quickly in 1938. And I always knew that my grandmother had been the matron in a hospital that for girls saved by the Kindertransport. But most of my life, I trained as a biologist, so I was a geneticist. And I was busy working in biosciences research and then teaching other people to use technology in their teaching and in medical education and working with librarians. And so it was only when I got made redundant, which was a really good thing, that I had time to start thinking about my background. And by then, my father had died. But when he died, he left an assortment of things. There was a big cardboard box of huge envelopes, and in them were amazing photographs. And each envelope he'd labeled Paula, Peter's mother, Froman, Peter's father, Herman's family, Paula's family, and the girls. And I realized I didn't really know anything. I didn't know who these people were. So as a geneticist, the first thing I did was begin to construct a family tree. And I discovered I'd got great aunts that I haven't really ever known had existed, several of them. He also left unpublished manuscripts from the 1970s. And then I found this little old attache case that had correspondence between him and his mom, mostly between him and my grandmother. Fortunately, they were English. And even more fortunately, my dad's letters were typed because his handwriting is appalling. There were also odd journals that he'd actually recorded during the war. So there was this wealth of information. And perhaps even more important, just before he died in 99, he tried to contact the girls he knew the Kinder. He was broadly, he spent his holidays with them. And so he tried to contact those that he could find to ask what they'd done with their lives, what they were doing now, what qualifications they'd got. And they wrote back incredibly movingly about their experiences of leaving their families as young children, anti-Semitism happening while they were at school. And they were mostly German or Austrian. There was one Czech girl. What it was like arriving in a foreign country with no language, with strange people. And now some of them had no idea where they were going. And they wrote really movingly about that sort of thing. And I had their contact details, and some were kind enough to let me go and see them. Now, sadly, there are far fewer than there were, but particularly with COVID. But we had these amazing afternoons with particularly Elfie, who was perhaps the kingpin in keeping them all together. And Inga, was the youngest child, she was only 5.5 when she left Germany. And she's alive and well and 90 and living in Wimbledon. And I speak to her quite regularly. So I had all that. And then we went to Vienna for a long weekend. And I'd very cheekily emailed the occupants of the flats. I always knew my grandmother had really posh flats. And we traditionally in the family go and stand outside the front door and get photographed if we're in Vienna. Anyway, this time I'd emailed all the flats I could find, the apartments. We had one invitation to coffee and to homemade strudel. And that turned out to be grandmother's flats. Now, our hosts were intrigued by presumably the presumption of my writing to them, had actually been to the archive. So they already knew an awful lot of the story. And the wife said, "You don't know what she knows. This could be really upsetting." it was only when I said something like cinema, the host then got out a carrier bag and handed me these papers from the archives about the cinema. And they were wonderful. They told us where to go, which archives to go to, who to contact, how to get to see my grandfather's grave and things like that. And so that holiday ended up with us rushing around the metro, looking at the archives. It was very interesting. So it began to throw all this together and started on a time frame. So I went back to my great grandparents, who were drapers in Brno, and Brno's in Czechoslovakia. And they had 3 shops because I had been to Brno in the 90s and met my grandmother's niece who survived a concentration camp. And she showed me where the shops had been. So we got to Brno. Then my grandmother was very small, very pretty, huge personality. And so she married the first man who would take her to the capital of Vienna. I'm sure it was a disaster. He was much older than she was, and he'd been leading a rather dissolute life in Vienna. Nevertheless, they married, went to Vienna. She had a baby, and then she discovered he was unfaced. So she grabbed the baby and got the train back to her parents. And she blossomed into being a very beautiful young woman. And I'm sure she found having a toddler extremely tedious. So she hung around in Brno for a while. And this is the bit none of us know or can find out. How she persuaded the family that as drapers in Brno, what they really needed was a cinema in Vienna. In 1915, she and her sister went off to Vienna to run the cinema the family had bought, the Kino. And eventually she got divorced. Along came my grandfather, and they had an absolutely glittering life. He was a rising lawyer. She opened balls. There are these photographs of her in the most amazing, glittery, sparkly dresses and huge furs. And when my father came along. But then tragically, my grandfather got killed in a road traffic accident. So she went back to running the cinema with her sister and raising her son and her first son, her baby son, and her elder son, my half uncle. That was fine, except anti-Semitism bloomed and life became harder for everybody. And I think one of the things I learned was that the deterioration over the 1930s. Now, Austria was different to Germany because Germany, it was quite slow and insidious. And Austria, you'd got this sudden invasion when the Nazis marched across the border. It's called the Anschluss in early 1938. But there were already ripples coming across the border. For example, Austria had a little film industry, but they couldn't employ Jews because they couldn't then sell the films in Germany. So a lot of Jewish actors and Jewish cinema people had already left. Anyway, my grandmother's posh flat overlooks the Ringstrasse, which is the great circle with the Grand Palais and the Opera House and things. It more or less overlooks the university. And so she and my dad watched Hitler's triumphal parade into Vienna. And she recognized she had to send her son to safety, which she did. She sent him, his half brother was already in London by then, so she sent him to Erich. And then had to raise the money herself. Now, that was really much harder because the cinema was simply confiscated, stolen. And at that point, and that was happened very early in the 30s, early in 1938, her sister had just been widowed and didn't want to live, and she needed the money as an income. So the cinema, their entire wealth was a cinema that had been confiscated, and they were being paid less than they needed to pay the staff. The flat was palatial at least, and everyone was trying to sell posh furniture at the time. And eventually she had to ask a former lover for money, which must have been really hard for such an independent woman, and arrived penniless in England. And she needed work. And so she eventually got a job as assistant matron in this hostel for girls saved on the Kindertransport. My dad then got a place, and this was in Tynemouth, and then later Windermere. And my dad then got a place Newcastle University, because they had 10 places for refugees. And so he stayed with members of the committee that had set up the hostel. Oh, you can stay for 2 weeks while you find somewhere. But in fact, he never really moved out. And that's why he wanted to ask the girls what they'd done, because he wanted to write a report to acknowledge the generosity of the committee. Because everyone talks about the Kinder and what happened to them, but few people talk about the people who cared for the Kinder and the people who made caring for the Kinder possible in England. Anyway, so that's what happened. And at the end of the war, Peter, my dad, then was in the Royal Navy, and he was the first enemy alien to serve in the Navy, and then in naval intelligence. And then at one point, he managed to get to Vienna on a mission and discovered that most of the family had not survived and that the cinema had been run into the ground. The next part of the story is trying to work out what happened to the cinema and what happened to the family that didn't survive, and mostly simply murdered. And then the end of the book is what happened to Paula's niece, Fritzi, in Brno, how she rebuilt her life under the communists, and then the lives of the Kinder and how they managed, despite these awful childhoods, to have extremely positive lives and families and grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. How can people contact you, follow you, reach out to you?
I've got a website, which is viviansieber.eu. Kino and Kinder is available on Amazon or any good bookshop. It can be ordered anywhere in the world. There is a Facebook Kino and Kinder group, which is growing. And I'm on Instagram and Twitter and things like that. So, in any of those ways, there is a contact form on the website, and the website's got some of the pictures that are in the book. One of the things about the book is it's got all these amazing photographs, not just of my grandmother in lots of fancy clothes, but of lots of the family. And some of the pictures of wartime Europe when my dad was posted to Northern Europe, which show complete devastation.
Yeah. And for all the audience out there, let's thank Vivian for coming onto the show. Check out her book. I'm sure it's on Amazon. Very courageous story. And with that, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.